made up of hundreds of thousands of text files. 58% of all the words people use are these function words. Now here's what's interesting. I just said that over 99% of all the words we know are content words, and less than 1% of what we know are function words. And in fact, in English, only about 180 function words are common. There's another 200 or 300 on top of that, but the common ones are these personal pronouns, impersonal pronouns, and so forth. They account for most of the words that we say, most of the words we hear, most of the words we listen to and read. And what's so interesting about these words is they are just different kinds of words. So the first is we can look at how they are represented in the brain. A person who has brain damage, say, to the temporal area, which is Wernicke's area, if there's brain damage there, the person has real trouble accessing any kind of content word, accessing nouns and regular verbs. However, if you have someone who has Wernicke's damage and their frontal lobe is working fine, in other words, their Broca's area is working fine, you ask them to describe something, they would, if I were going to describe my office and I had Wernicke's damage, I'd answer, okay, sure. Well, over here you can see this, and over there is that, and it's right next to that over there, and it's above that one, you know. So I'm saying words that sometimes referred to as a word salad. If you were here and you can see my eyes and watch me point, you know what I'm trying to convey, but I'm only using these function words. Whereas if I have damage to Broca's area in the frontal lobe, and my Wernicke's area is working just fine, and I'm asked to describe what's in my office, I will be socially really closed, and I'll say telephone, table, black computer screen. In other words, I won't be able to convey information in a normal way, and I will have real difficulty using any function words. Now, who cares? Well, I care, and the reason I care is these function words are superbly social. And by that I mean, let's say, for example, I'm talking about my computer screen, and I'm talking to you guys today, and I keep referring to this screen in front of me. And a minute from now, I make some other reference to the screen. You know what screen I'm talking about. So after today's talk, let's say you go and see a friend, you say, oh yeah, I was listening to Pennebaker, he was talking about the screen. Well, your friend's going to say, what do you mean the screen? The use of the word "the" is interesting because it refers explicitly to this particular screen that all of you and I know what it refers to. It refers to a particular screen in a particular location, at a particular time, particular day, among us, and it has no meaning to anybody else. Or think of another example. You walk into an office of a friend of yours, or you walk into your own office and someone has slipped under your door, or you're not actually sure how it got there. The note says, I'm not here now, I'll be back soon. Well, on one level it makes perfect sense, but on another level it makes no sense at all, especially if you have no idea who wrote it. Who's I? Will be back. Will implies future tense. When was this written? Soon, same thing. All of those words are function words, and they are shared between the speaker and listener. Now here's what's interesting about function words. They require social skills to use and to understand. And the more we use social skills, the more we need to be aware of nuanced features of our social lives. And more than that, function words are telling us where people are paying attention and how they're thinking. And therein is the interesting story of function words. Many years ago, I did a project. I teach very large sections of introductory psychology. And I asked students, this actually ended up being several thousand students, to describe a TAT picture. And I went through and I truly randomly pulled out the first sentence of three cases. So the first one you see here. In the aforementioned picture, an elderly woman is about to speak to a middle-aged woman who looks condescending and calculating. The second person says, I see an old woman looking back on her years, remembering how it was to be beautiful and young. And the third, the old woman is a witch or something. She looks kind of like she is coaxing the young one to do something. Now here's what's interesting. I know from my research that one of these three people is a male. I know one of these three people is depression prone. And I know one of these three people probably is having trouble with alcohol and is probably not going to do very well at the university. How do I know these things? The way I know these things is by looking at the way they're using these function words. So we go to this second one. Let me just go back and forth. So here's the original text. There is, what we've done is pulled out the function words. So the first person in the aforementioned and is about to a, who, and compare that with the last one. The is a or something, she kind of like, she is the, etc. First of all, you see that the third person is using function words at a tremendously high rate, and the first person is using them at a very low rate. Another issue is the way they're using different words. So if you would guess, I don't know if who you guessed who the male was, but the answer is clearly the first person. The person is using big words, does not use the word I much, doesn't use personal pronouns much at all. The other two are clearly females. They use a high rate of pronouns, both personal and impersonal pronouns. The person who is the second one is probably depression prone, simply because she does use the word I. And in this context, it's odd to do that. In other words, you're asked to describe the picture, but that author starts off with I see. And yet the third one uses the most kind of everyday language, and this person is probably not doing very well in school and is clearly a female as well. Now, I say all of this based on research that I've done now over the last several years that allows us to start looking at text and get a sense of who the author is. And this is based on the analysis of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of files, everything from books and natural conversation to poems to songs to Supreme Court decisions to court transcripts and so forth. And what I like to do is kind of speed through, give you kind of an overview of some of the things that we've been looking at over the last few years. Now, here are some of the broad categories that I've been interested in. The first is how we can use these words to get a better sense of individuals, looking at their psychological states, their cognitive styles, their emotions. And the second is to start to use the power of language analysis to get a better sense of human relationships. And finally, I'll talk just very briefly on how this is relevant to understanding not just individuals or dyads or pairs of people, but looking at groups of people at the community level, at the cultural level, or even starting to look at these things in a more distanced way, thinking about looking at this, getting a better sense of history. So, very briefly, we can get a sense of who a person is by the way they use everyday language. And we get a sense of their background, where they're from, their personality, and so forth. Now, in many ways, it's not wildly different from the way that we can do that by listening to somebody's accent. If we listen to somebody's accent, if we're dealing with someone in the United States, we get a decent sense of where they're from. If we're particularly attuned to accents, we can pick up if they're from the north or south or east or west. We can, if it's possible in your state, if the migration is low, you do a pretty good job at identifying where which part of the state they're from, or if it's from a big city, possibly even a different part, which part of the city. We can do the same thing in terms of the way that people use language itself. So, for example, we do a good job at identifying if there's a transcript of a woman versus a man's talking, or they're writing samples as well. Women, for example, use language in ways that many people kind of goes against kind of the stereotypes. So, for example, women use the word I at much higher rates than men. And one reason is you're going to hear me use the examples of I quite a bit. Pronouns tell us where people are paying attention. If a person is attentive to their emotional states, their moods, to their body, they by definition will use the word I more. When people are physically sick, they use the word I more. That their body is drawing their attention inwardly. A person who is depressed or suicidal pays attention to their body more, and they use the word I at much higher rates. We can also look at social class differences. We can look at age differences. Some of the age differences are really quite striking. People who are insecure use the word I at much higher rates than people who are not insecure. Well, people who are insecure are young kids. The younger you are, the more insecure you are, the more you use the word I. And as we get older, we use I less and less, and it's almost a linear relationship. So we have writing samples of people who are 60, 70, 80 years old. They use I at maybe 3 to 4% of their words, compared to 30-year-olds who might use it at 5 or 6%, college students maybe 7%, for 13-year-olds maybe 12%, and 4-year-olds maybe as high as 15%. It's really quite striking. We also know that the older people get, the less they use negative emotion words, and the more they use positive emotion words. Again, this goes counter to our stereotypes of the bitter, angry old people drooling in a rocking chair. Also, as people get older, they tend to be more cognitive. They use more cognitive words as they get older. We also find that there are big differences in language as a function of personality. So we know that people who are arrogant and dominant, they use the word I at very low rates, which goes against, I think, a lot of people's sense. Most people think that someone who's arrogant and self-important would use I at high rates, but in fact they don't. We know that people who are neurotic use I words at high rates. We know there are many other dimensions of language that we're able to get a sense of people. We're also able to look at emotional states and emotional reactions. So, for example, suicidal poets use the word I more in their poetry than non-suicidal poets. Ironically, there's no difference between those two groups in terms of their use of negative emotion words. We've also looked at these words as a function of, here's some poetry examples. Every day it's always good to start off with a little Sylvia Plath to put you in a good mood. You'll see Sylvia Plath committed suicide. She was born about the same time as Denise Levertov, who lived until about the age of 72, who died fairly recently. In these two poems, they're both talking about the loss of a relationship, or the problems of relationships. And you can look at the Plath poem and look at all the rate that she uses I. I shut my eyes and all the world drops dead. I lift my lids and all is born again. I think I made you up inside my head, etc. Whereas Denise Levertov is talking about the name of this is called The Ache of Marriage. And in it, so for example, it goes, the ache of marriage, thigh and tongue, beloved, are heavy with it. It throbs in the teeth. We look for communion and are turned away, beloved, each and each. It is Leviathan, and so forth. With her, you can almost see that she's standing back, looking at the pain of this relationship, but from a more distanced third-person perspective, whereas Plath is more immersed in her misery. Maybe that's why we like Plath more. We like to be closer to the edge, and she certainly took us there more than Levertov did. Now we can also look at at emotional states on a cultural level. So these were blogs, live journal blogs, which that surrounded September 11th. And what you see around September 11th is there's this, I should say this is based on 70,000 blog entries from 1,000 people. And these people were all, to be in our study, they had to write lots of blog entries. And half of these, 35,000 of the blogs, were at baseline, which is represented by that point B on the left side of the graph. And what you see is immediately after September 11th, one of the most striking changes was this really significant drop in the use of the word I. So immediately afterwards, people dropped from 7% to under 6% in terms of use of I. And over the next 2 months that we collected data, they didn't even return back to their original baseline. People who are in pain tend to drop in their use of I. And you probably are picking up an odd inconsistency. Here I said that depressed people use the word I more compared to people who are not depressed, which is true. And here, immediately after September 11th, here the entire culture is very sad, but they're dropping in their use of I. And here's where the distinction between a depressed person and a non-depressed person becomes strikingly clear. A healthy person, in response to something threatening or depressing, naturally regulates their emotions by trying to psychologically distance themselves some. They try not to pay attention to themselves. So, for example, in analyses of people who have just experienced the death of somebody very close to them, I found that they use the word I at very low rates. Are they in pain? Yes, they're in tremendous pain, but they're trying to control it to some degree. It would be interesting to do this same study with 9/11 with people who were clinically depressed. I suspect we would not find that drop in I, but I don't know for sure. Just as there's a drop in I, there's a corresponding increase in we. That something like 9/11 was this powerful psychological and social event that brought people together. Now what's interesting is we can also compare this with emotion words. Now these effects are intriguing because they kind of go against certain common sense. Immediately after 9/11, you can tell with the green line that people became increased their use of negative emotion words. And that lasted for about a week, maybe 11 days. More interesting were positive emotion words. You'll see that there was a predictable giant drop in use of positive emotion words on the day of 9/11 and 9/12. But by 4 days afterwards, what you see is their use of positive emotion words goes to levels above baseline, and they stay at that rate for the next 2 months. Ironically, 9/11 brought people together. People actually express more positive emotions in the days and weeks after 9/11. An event such as this is a really powerful social event and social experience that has these unintended consequences that often are more positive than I think we would expect. Now one area that I started to do a lot of work on in the last year or so is to start looking at the nature of language, focusing on thinking styles. And there's some really odd features of language that I certainly wouldn't have predicted and have not come across it in the literature anywhere. It shows that if you go in and you get any group of text, let's say that we have, for example, we've analyzed 50,000 essays from This I Believe, the radio show, or we've analyzed 50,000 essays that students wrote to when they were applying to college. And these are admissions essays applying to here at the University of Texas over 4 years. What we find is, in general, the more that people use nouns, the less they use verbs. The more they use articles and prepositions, the less they use pronouns and auxiliary verbs. Now, if you're like me, you're sitting there thinking, A, who cares? B, why is this remotely interesting or important? Well, it turns out it's interesting because these effects are huge. It also means I always kind of assumed that using nouns and verbs there was some kind of law that everybody has to have so many nouns and so many verbs just to string together a sentence. But that's not the case. You have some people who are big noun people and some people who are big verb people. And it turns out these noun people also, by the way, they use articles and prepositions at high rates, tend to be males. They tend to be more formal. And people who tend to use more verbs and auxiliary verbs also tend to use more pronouns. What's interesting is these two types reflect different thinking styles. We refer to them as analytic thinkers. An analytic thinker is somebody who is looking at things in this more formal way, in a more structured way. And that their opposite are people who are what we call dynamic or narrative thinkers. These are people who naturally tell stories at high rates. So we've gone through and we've analyzed these admissions essays. So 50,000 admission essays from 25,000 students over 4 years. And then we track their grade point average over 4 years. And what we find is very clear. The more someone is an analytic thinker, the better they do in college across all 4 years. The more they use nouns, articles, prepositions in that essay, the higher grades they make, even if they're an engineer, fine arts major, a psychology major, it makes no difference. What this is telling us is that this kind of thinking, this kind of analytic thinking that we can see just in counting articles and prepositions and so forth, is a window into the types of thinking that we reward at universities. So if you come to the university and you are a great storyteller, well, that's beautiful, but you're not going to do very well in college unless you can also be analytic. Ironically, the only personality variable we find that's associated with this is being socially engaged. Narrative thinkers are more socially engaged. These effects, by the way, hold up whether you're a male or female, it makes no difference. So this is one of the directions that we've become really excited about. Okay, now let me go and look and talk some about this idea about human relationships and the idea here is we're interested in if we get two people interacting, or maybe 3 or 4 or 5, what can we tell about them by the way the two of them are using language? Well, one strategy is to look at the degree to which they match each other in their use of pronouns and articles and prepositions and so forth. And we call this language style matching. Now we can start off with one of the simplest, and this is looking at status. If you get 2 people, you will find that sometimes the level of their use of first-person singular, I, me, and my, is the same. And when it's the same, whether it's low usage or high usage, it means the two are matching each other at the time. And it also means, not or surprisingly, is that there is a great deal of equity in their relationship. What becomes interesting is when the two don't match. One person starts using the word I at much higher rates than the other. But what we've now found across multiple studies is the more disparity there is in their use of I, the more disparity there is in their status. And specifically, the person who uses the word I more has lower status. And these are not subtle effects, they're big effects. And if you want to depress yourself, go look at your emails and look at people where you know there's a disparity in status. And you're going to find that the high status person is using the word I less, the low status person is using the word I more. And I've found this in my own, when I did the first study and analyzed the effects, I was shocked how big the effects were, and I thought it couldn't possibly be true for me. And then I went and looked at my own emails, and I was the same as everybody else. When a student, an undergraduate, would write me, that student might write saying, Dear Dr. Pennebaker, I am doing this, and I'm doing this, and I would like this. And I would write back, dear student, thank you for your email. Unfortunately, blah, 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 blah. And then I look at my emails to the dean. Dear Dean, I'm Jamie, and I'm doing this, and I need this, and I was wondering if I could do this. And the dean writes back, dear Jamie, thank you so much for your email. Unfortunately, the university, blah, blah, blah. Well, what's interesting about that is we're all being very friendly. Everyone is respectful of one another, but we still see these status differences in the way that we're using language. Now, we can expand this to a much broader group of broader language issues, and some that in many ways that are more, I think, powerful. One strategy is to look not just at pronouns, but to look at all of these function words. And this is the way that we currently do language style matching. And what we're finding when we do this is that we can get a very good sense of how well two or more people are working together. With couples, we can see how the couple is getting along. One of my very favorite ones is a project we did a couple of years ago on speed dating. What we did was we had these students. It was a speed dating project that was run by Eli Finkel and his group at Northwestern, but we ended up analyzing their data. Molly Island and I did this. And what we found was that in speed dating, we would tape record these couples interactions. They were 4-minute interactions. We ended up predicting who'd go on a date at rates better than the students themselves. Now that's pretty cool. So what that meant was very often the two people would disagree. So one person would say, oh, it was a beautiful relationship. And the other person would say, I don't want to see the other person again in my life. But we would pick that up with the style matching. They would come across as not style matching at all. We did a later study looking at young dating couples. And in this project, we looked at 84 different couples, or maybe 86. This was a project that Richard Slatcher and I had done. And what we found by analyzing their instant messages is that we could predict who'd be together 3 months later at rates far, far better than they could. The point is that just by looking at people's natural language in these relationships, we can get a sense of the quality of their relationship. We're also now starting to look at this in terms of groups and group productivity. So we're looking at education groups. We've done lab studies. We've worked with people in the business school who look at working groups. And what we find is that by looking at this language style matching, we're getting a sense of how cohesive the group is, but also how productive it is. Now this brings us to this broader issue of looking at communities, cultures, and history. We initially, or I initially, thought of this language analysis approach as a way to get a sense of individuals, and then that led to groups. And then I started looking at this broader level of blogs, and the 9/11 project is a good example of that. But it turns out there's many other ways to look at things. So for example, we've been looking at communities. Can you get a sense of how cohesive a community would be by looking at how the community uses language? Well, the answer is yes. We've started to look at Craigslist, for example. So we go into individual communities, and what we find on Craigslist is the more similar the community uses language, the more cohesive the city is. And one way that we measure cohesiveness is by looking at something that's called the Gini index. It tells us the disparity between rich and poor in a community. The greater the disparity in wealth in the community, the less similarly people talk in the community. And I've been really struck by how this is such an interesting way to start thinking about communities. And we're now starting to look at language in terms of comparing language in one culture versus another. We do a lot of cross-language projects. And one direction we're moving in as well is looking at more historical analyses. One place that I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, is to go to Google Labs, and they've got a group that one of their addresses is, I think it's called googlelabs.com/ngrams, or you can just Google ngrams, and this is the part of the Google Book Project, and it allows you to look at words or groups of words as they have been used in published books over the last 500 years. And you get this sense of how we can start to get a sense of culture, how we can get a sense of history in terms of what ideas are interesting and what ideas are important to that culture. What I've tried to do today is to give you a very quick and dirty overview of some of the possibilities with language. And that words, I think everybody agrees language is important. Everybody certainly agrees that content words are important. But what I hope I've given you a sense of is just the power of these function words to get a sense of how they reflect psychological state. Now this brings up a related question, and that is, do function words shape how we think, or do they just merely reflect how we think? And all the data that we found in our lab is function words are great reflections of psychological state. They don't shape how we think. In other words, you can't bring a client in who's depressed and say, okay, just stop using the word I. In fact, it will make no difference. But if that depressed person stops becoming depressed, they'll start using the word I less. One other issue that, or a couple of other issues is, if you're interested in language, and if you have a background in any kind of language analysis, whatever, the questions I'm talking about are deeply social psychological. Go talk to a social psychologist. Take one to lunch. Because the questions that the social psychologists are asking are really critical. Now the big problem that social psychologists have is that they're stuck on questionnaires too much, and they need to hear more about language. So if you know about language, take one out and explain that to them. The last thing I want to mention, because we're about to go into question and answer, is you're safe. Our brain is not capable of telling if someone is using the word I at high rates or low rates. Even if you send an email to me or anybody else, I can't see if your I levels are high or low. The difference between using 8% of your words I versus 6% is a huge, huge difference. But we just don't have the mental apparatus to tell the difference, so you're safe. Now here's some web addresses that I recommend. The first one is just my web page, and most of these other places it'll take you there. The bottom web page is secretlifeofpronouns.com, which is a shameless plug for my book under the same name, Secret Life of Pronouns. But on it, if you go, there's an exercise page. And if you go there, you can actually analyze text of your own. You can run language style matching. You can do, I've got a bunch of other tests and surveys that I've made that do an analysis of language. And one of the other ones is analyzewords.com. If you're a big Twitter fan, you can enter Twitter addresses, and it will do a kind of a haphazard personality analysis of people based on their use of language. So I'm going to stop here and open this up to questions, and I'm not sure how it works, but I'm sure Megan will explain it all to us.
Hi. Okay, so I'm actually just going to unmute everybody. So if anyone has any questions, just feel free to ask. Let me see if we're getting some feedback. I'll take care of that.
Okay, so that looks like a turkey farm.
Okay, hold on. Trying to figure out where this background noise is coming from. do it this way.
I'm muted.
Okay, I think we're okay. Okay. I think we're good. So if anyone has any questions.
Okay, I see somebody has asked a question. Cedar has asked a question. Even though we are safe, can we pay attention to our eye use? Is it useless to tell students to watch their status signals on emails? No. In fact, this is where I think this becomes most interesting, that when people, we can use our own use of language to get a better sense of our own psychological state. So, for example, often when I write an email, before I send it, I sometimes kind of look over it to get a sense of how I might be coming across. And I would encourage students and others to watch their emails. Coming across sometimes as perhaps too arrogant, maybe not being forceful enough, or, you know, as an administrator, one of the goals I'm often trying to do is trying to get everybody on the same page, to get everybody in a we mindset, if you like. And when I do that, I sometimes will go back and look, and sometimes I'll say, well, you all need to do, well, whenever you start using you are almost by definition building a wedge between you and the other people. And when I use the word we, I make it very clear who we is. So I will say, all of us in the department, we believe, or something like that, because very often we is used in this really distant, told way. So I do think all of this can be really helpful. Okay, other questions?
Yeah, and if anyone is muted, it's just because there's background noise coming. So you can type your question in the chat box, and we'll address it there.
Have I done any work on language differences based on ideology? I've done a little bit. Other people have done more than I have. It's been interesting in terms, actually, there's a couple of them. One has been Republicans and Democrats, but the other one has been extremist groups. A few years ago, I did a project with Connor Selye, who was a student that I worked with, and he was interested in extremist groups. And our extremists, I wanted to get both left wing and right wing, so we got PETA and neo-Nazi groups. I know that doesn't sound like a fair comparison, but other kind of true believer groups, and we compared them with kind of boring middle-of-the-road groups, like New York Times discussion groups or things like that. And what we found was the more that a person is a true believer, the more they make big distinctions between we and them, the more they use words that are certainty-type words. And it turns out that the extremist liberal and the extremist conservatives were remarkably similar in their language styles. In terms of Republicans and Democrats, Republicans are a little bit more analytic, so they use articles at higher rates, and Democrats tend to be a little bit more narrative. The differences are not huge, but they're kind of there. Okay, here's another question. I will be using this information and checking the websites for information included in classes. Will it be possible to obtain the PowerPoint? Absolutely. I don't know how to do it.
Jamie, you can. I think I already have it. So I'm going to send out a follow-up email, and I'll just attach it if that's all right.
Sure, that'll be great. That'll be great. Also, that first the web address is that first one. If you go to that, that's got a really large number of resources for people to look at, both for language and some of my other research as well.
I think we also have a question from Kendra. It's above Terry's. She says, is it possible to tell the difference in text between someone who is low status, depressed, neurotic, or a woman if they all involve high use of the word I?
Yes, and what you would do with this is there's some other words that you can start looking at. So for example, it'll depend on the context. So for example, a person who's low status also uses a lot of present tense verbs in addition to I, whereas men and women don't differ that much on present tense verbs. Depressed and neurotic people, in addition to using I, also use negative emotion words at rates above what these other groups would. So you can start putting together groups of words to get a better picture of who a person might be. Okay, Kathleen. I'm a relatively new faculty member at a college on the Navajo reservation, wondering how I might make use of this information to cross the sizable cultural divide between traditional Navajo culture and the demands of contemporary college education. Man, what a wonderful question. I think, I know what I would do if I were there, which would be try to get as many writing samples from students as possible, just to get a sense of how they're putting things together. So for example, one thing that I do in my introductory psychology class is the first meeting, or one of the first meetings, I have them do a stream of consciousness writing. I say, okay, for the next 15 minutes, I want you just to start writing. Don't worry about grammar, sentence structure, spelling, just write. Try to track your thoughts and feelings as they occur. What I would, it would be interesting to get that and then compare how they write compared to a more traditional Western group and start to get a sense of their language. I also think it's really valuable. Also, I think another one would be to have them do a writing sample to write about who they are individually. Just, for the next 15 minutes, write about your deepest thoughts about who you are, who made you what you are, and so forth. In my experience of dealing with college students, just reading them is a really powerful sense of getting kind of inside their heads. From a statistical perspective, of course, you could send me all of them, and I'd love to analyze them and compare them with tens of thousands of essays I have of college students who've done the same thing. But I guess that would be my first general recommendation, and I'm not sure how helpful it will be in terms of understanding language, but it will give you a sense of getting a little bit more into their world perspective. I'm also curious to the degree to which they use articles and nouns at high rates. Other questions? Here we go. Oh, excellent.
So any other questions from anybody? Okay. So I just wanted to let everyone know that I'm going to be sending out a follow-up email, and attached to that there will be a survey, which it would be great if you would be able to fill it out so we can improve our future webinars. And once again, I just want to give a big thanks to everyone for attending today and for sharing your good thoughts, and also a big thanks to Jamie for presenting to us.
You bet. Also, I see Connie is dying to know about my book. I just entered the title of it, and it's in hardback now. You can also get it on Amazon, both Kindle and buy it there, but also the paperback will be coming out in a couple of months, I've been told. It's a classic. Well, thank you all very much, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me.
And I'll be sending out the PowerPoint with Jamie's email in the, I guess, next to last slide, so everyone will receive it. So thank you, everybody.